Well, today is part 4 of our study on Genesis 2, 1 through 3. Today we're finishing up looking at verse 3. So, on this day, creation, or the day, seventh day of creation, was blessed by God. It was blessed and sanctified by God. The seventh day was a blessed day, which means he chose to place his divine favor on that day. That's what blessing means. When God blesses something, he puts his divine favor on it. And so he places his divine favor on the seventh day. God set it apart for holy purposes. That's what it means that he sanctified it. He blessed it and sanctified it. So he set it apart for holy purposes. The seventh day was set aside for God, not for God, but by God, for holy, sacred, or religious use. Remember, the Sabbath day was not for God, it was for man. But like all things, people either forgot or misunderstood why God created the seventh day of rest. Jesus rebuked the misunderstanding of the Pharisees by choosing to heal people on the Sabbath. I mean, he could have chose any other day, but he chose the Sabbath day specifically. You know, when he was accused of breaking the Sabbath, when he's accused of breaking the Sabbath law that we find in the Ten Commandments, Jesus said in Mark chapter 2, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The day was made for man. It wasn't for God as if God needed it. The seventh day Sabbath came after the creation of man for man. So if God didn't need the Sabbath, then what is the day for? Well, the seventh day was to be a day of remembrance and a day of relationship. A day of remembrance and relationship. As J.C. Ryle points out to us, God made it for Adam in paradise and renewed it to Israel on Mount Sinai. It was made for all mankind, not for the Jew only, but for the whole family of Adam. It was made for man's benefit and happiness. It was for the good of his body, the good of his mind, and the good of his soul. It was given to him as a benefit and a blessing, and not a burden. This was the original institution. So, when the law was given to Israel, God told them to remember the Sabbath day. Not because they had forgotten that it existed. They didn't forget the day number 7 was missing. They didn't forget Saturday was there. They knew Saturday existed. But what they had forgotten to do was to keep it in mind, with regard, with the idea of keeping it sacred, keeping it separate from the other days. They forgot to observe it. The Sabbath started the day after Adam was created, and it would continue on. The Mosaic Law did not establish the seventh day. The seventh day was already there. The call to observe it was already there. But the people needed to be reminded to celebrate it. They had forgotten to celebrate that day. On it, they were to do no work because on the seventh day, God did not work. On the Sabbath, they were to think about God. They were to remember what God had done for them. In Deuteronomy 5:15, Moses tells the people that on the Sabbath day, they were to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So the Sabbath day was established for man to get to know his God. It wasn't meant to be a burden. It wasn't meant to be, oh man, now we got to go out and we got to take a day off of work. We can't do what we want to do. No, it was the idea that the Sabbath was to break them from the rest of the work week, but then it was to drive them to God, to make them think about God, to have a relationship with God, because the rest of the week they might forget about God. They're doing their own thing. They might forget about the fact that he's in control, that he's providing everything that they've done throughout the rest of the week. But on the Sabbath day, they were called back to remember what God had done. Remember the 10 plagues. Remember the blood on the doorpost. Remember that the death angel passed over you and didn't kill you. Remember that you were led out from slavery. Remember the crossing of the Red Sea. Remember the provision of manna. Remember all these things that God has done for you. Remember that relationship, that God came to you and rescued you and pulled you out. He chose to do that for you. Remember those things on the Sabbath day and keep it holy.